A German shepherd kept bringing rocks from the woods. When the owner realized what they were, he cried. At first, he thought his dog was just playing. Every day, another stone. Smooth, heavy, strange. But then he saw something. Tiny letters carved beneath the dirt, and his hands started shaking. These weren't just rocks, they were markers, names, dates, forgotten lives pulled from the ground one by one. What the dog had found wasn't a game. It was a secret someone buried deep, and was willing to destroy anyone who uncovered it. As the truth rises from the mud, one man is forced to face the ghosts of his past, and the price of silence. What was really buried beneath those woods? And when the last stone is uncovered, will it bring peace or destroy everything he has left? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Hollow as Theodore Hoyt stepped out onto his worn front porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath his work boots, a familiar sound that had become part of his daily ritual. Rook, his German shepherd, stood alert at his side, muscular body tense with anticipation for their morning run. Theodore's weathered face showed the marks of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. Deep lines creased the corners of his eyes, carved there by sun and sorrow in equal measure. He adjusted the zipper of his jacket against the morning chill, trying to push away the heaviness that always seemed to settle over him at this hour. "All right, boy, let's go," he said quietly. Rook's ears perked up at the command, and they set off toward their usual path near the new subdivision. The development had sprung up like mushrooms after rain, cookie-cutter houses replacing the ancient trees Theodore had known for decades. He tried not to look too hard at the perfectly manicured lawns that now covered ground he'd once known as sacred. Instead, he focused on Rook's steady trot ahead of him, the dog's dark sable fur gleaming in the early light. They were about halfway through their usual route when Rook suddenly veered off the path, nose to the ground. Theodore watched as his companion disappeared into the tree line, knowing better than to call him back. Rook was too well trained to wander without purpose. Minutes later, the shepherd emerged with something in his mouth. Theodore expected a stick or perhaps a tennis ball lost by one of the neighborhood kids. But what Rook dropped at his feet was different, a mud-caked object about the size of his palm. "What have you got there, boy?" Theodore bent down to examine it. Through the coating of dirt, it felt unnaturally smooth beneath his fingers. Something about its weight and shape stirred an old memory he couldn't quite grasp. Back at his modest house, Theodore stood at the kitchen sink, running water over what he'd initially thought was just a rock. As this mud washed away, his hands began to shake. There, beneath the mineral crust that had built up over time, he could make out the faint impression of a drill hole. His throat went dry. 20 years as a cemetery groundsman had taught him to recognize certain things. The way the stone was cut, the particular smoothness that came from careful shaping rather than natural weathering. This wasn't just any rock, it was worked stone. Theodore placed it on the counter, reaching for the reading glasses he kept in his shirt pocket. With trembling fingers, he turned the stone over and over, examining every surface. Years of mineral deposits had crusted over most of it, but there was something else there, the ghost of an engraving beneath the buildup. He couldn't bring himself to name what he was looking at, what he suspected it might be. The weight of it in his hands felt like guilt, heavy and cold. It brought back memories of papers he'd signed years ago, assurances from developers about respectful relocation of the old churchyard. The same developers who'd broken ground on their new subdivision just weeks before his daughter was stillborn. Throughout the day, Theodore tried to focus on his usual tasks, mending the back fence, checking his small vegetable garden, but his eyes kept drifting to the stone sitting on his kitchen counter. Rook seemed to sense his unease, staying closer than usual, pressing against Theodore's leg whenever he stopped moving. As dusk approached, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, Rook began pacing by the front door. The shepherd's nails clicked against the hardwood floors in a steady rhythm, his body language clear. He wanted to go back to where he'd found the stone. Theodore picked up the object from the counter and moved to the living room window. The setting sun had given way to lamplight, and as he turned the stone under the warm glow, his heart nearly stopped. There, barely visible beneath years of mineral buildup, was a single carved letter. He placed the stone carefully on the windowsill, unable to look away from that solitary mark. Behind him, Rook's pacing continued, but Theodore remained frozen, lost in memories of other stones he'd known, other letters he'd traced with his fingers in another life. The truth he'd been avoiding all day settled over him like a heavy blanket. This was no ordinary rock. This was a piece of someone's memory, someone's final marker, and it had no business being buried in the mud near a new housing development. The clock on his wall ticked steadily, marking time as Theodore stood at the window, the weight of discovery pressing down on his shoulders. Rook whined softly by the door, eager to return to the tree line, but Theodore couldn't move just yet. That single carved letter seemed to glow in the lamplight, a silent accusation of things long buried but never truly forgotten. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Theodore's hands shook as he poured his coffee, still unsettled by yesterday's discovery. Rook waited impatiently by the door, his amber eyes fixed on his master with unusual intensity. "All right, boy, let's go." They followed the same path as yesterday, Theodore's heart pounding with each step closer to the subdivision. Just like before, Rook suddenly darted into the tree line. This time, Theodore followed. The German shepherd returned quickly, carrying another mud-covered stone. Theodore's stomach twisted as he took it from Rook's gentle grip. Even through the coating of dirt, he could tell it was larger than yesterday's find. Back home, Theodore stood at his sink again, water running over trembling fingers as he cleaned the stone. As the mud washed away, his world stopped. There, carved into the weathered surface, was a name and date that made his knees buckle. Theo, the very name he and his wife had chosen for their daughter, followed by a date he knew by heart. Theodore slid down against his kitchen cabinets, the stone clutched to his chest. Rook pressed against him, whining softly. The dog's warm presence anchored him as memories crashed over him like waves. The stillbirth, the funeral, the tiny marker they'd placed in the old churchyard. With shaking fingers, he dialed the county office. The clerk's voice was bored, dismissive. "Sir, construction crews often find old landscaping materials. Nothing to worry about?" "This isn't landscaping material," Theodore insisted. "These are grave markers." "I'll transfer you to the sheriff's office." The sheriff was no more helpful. "Mr. Hoyt, we've been through this before. That land was properly cleared years ago, unless you have proof of current wrongdoing." Theodore hung up, fury and helplessness warring in his chest. He grabbed his keys and drove to the subdivision's edge, parking where he could see the drainage ditch and retention pond. The newly graded earth looked raw, exposed. Water trickled through channels cut into the red clay, carrying soil toward the pond. He knew who might listen. June Pennington had been the only reporter who'd taken his concerns seriously during the land transfer. She'd written a series of articles questioning the development company's methods, even after pressure to drop the story. Theodore found her number in his old contacts. To his surprise, she answered on the second ring. "June Pennington." "Ms. Pennington, this is Theodore Hoyt. From the old churchyard case?" A pause. I remember. What's wrong? He explained about the stones, his voice breaking when he described the second one. I know how it sounds, but I'll be there in 20 minutes, June interrupted. Text me your address. True to her word, June arrived exactly 20 minutes later, her reporter's notebook already in hand. She examined both stones carefully, her sharp features focused as she took photographs from multiple angles. You're sure about the connection? She asked, though her tone suggested she already believed him. Theodore nodded. That's my daughter's name, her date. We buried her in the old churchyard before... He couldn't finish. June's expression softened. Before they moved everything. I remember covering that. She set the stones down gently. Theodore, we need to document everything properly this time. No confrontations yet, no accusations we can't prove. The shame he'd been carrying for years finally spilled out. I signed off on it, you know. They put a maintenance clearance form in front of me, talked about routine updates. I didn't read it carefully enough. By the time I realized what it really meant... You were grieving, June said firmly. They took advantage of that. But now we have a chance to make it right. She glanced at Rook, who sat alertly watching them. Your dog found these? Theodore nodded. Then let's start where he's leading us. First light tomorrow, we check those runoff channels properly. Document everything. She pulled out her camera. For now, I need detailed shots of both stones. As June photographed the evidence, Theodore sat at his kitchen table, the weight of possibility pressing down on him. After she left, he placed the two stones side by side on his windowsill. His fingers traced the weathered letter on the first stone, the one that matched his daughter's marker perfectly. The touch connected him to something he'd thought lost forever. Not just memory, but purpose. Rook laid his head on Theodore's knee, offering silent comfort as the last light faded outside. Tomorrow would bring answers, or at least the start of them. For now, the stones stood as silent witnesses to truths that could no longer stay buried. The early morning mist clung to the ground as Theodore, June, and Rook made their way toward the retention pond. The sun hadn't yet cleared the tree line, casting long shadows across the construction site. Their footsteps crunched softly on frost-covered grass as they followed the winding drainage ditch. Rook trotted ahead, his nose working the ground with purpose. The German shepherd's dark fur blended with the shadows as he wove between clumps of cattails and reeds. Suddenly, he stopped, tail straight, and began pawing at something in the tangles. He's found something, Theodore said, his voice barely above a whisper. June readied her camera as Rook dragged another stone from the reeds. This one was larger than the others, its surface coated in green algae and pond scum. Theodore's hands trembled as he pulled a water bottle from his backpack and carefully rinsed a corner. Look here, he said, pointing to a drill hole. And see how the edge is beveled? That's intentional stonework, not natural wear. June crouched beside him, snapping close-up photos. Can you tell what it was originally? A footstone, no question. The dimensions, the finishing work, I handled hundreds like this during my years at the cemetery. They moved closer to the retention pond, where riprap lined the banks to prevent erosion. Theodore's stomach turned, as his experienced eye took in details others might miss. Stop, he said suddenly, grabbing June's arm. Look at how these rocks are placed. June peered where he pointed. They look connected somehow? They're wired together. Theodore's voice was thick with disgust. See the steel cables? That's not standard erosion control. They're trying to hide what these really are. He knelt and traced his fingers over one of the stones. Years of working with grave markers had taught him to read the subtle language of carved stone. This type of marble, the grain pattern. And look here. He wet his thumb and rubbed at a dark patch. You can just make out initials under the mineral staining. June photographed everything methodically. The wire connections, the drill holes, the ghost-like traces of letters emerging under Theodore's careful cleaning. She paid special attention to before and after shots, documenting how the stones transformed from anonymous rocks to clearly worked markers. Theodore pulled out his old survey maps and began marking coordinates, his former groundskeeper's knowledge guiding his hand. As the morning wore on, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just carelessness, he muttered. This was systematic. They stripped the footstones, drilled them for wiring, and used them as cheap building material. How many do you think? June asked quietly. Theodore studied his rough sketches. Dozens at least, maybe hundreds. He swallowed hard. They saved money on proper erosion control by desecrating graves. Rook continued his methodical search, bringing stone after stone to their feet. Each one told the same story, carefully carved markers reduced to anonymous riprap, their names and dates buried under years of mineral buildup and deliberate neglect. A distant engine sound made them all freeze. A white security truck had appeared on the far access road, idling as the driver surveyed the area. "Keep working," June whispered, "but stay low. We're just bird watchers if anyone asks." They continued documenting their finds, speaking in hushed tones as the truck eventually moved on. Theodore's hands shook as he cleaned each stone Rook retrieved, his stonemason's eye noting every chisel mark and drill hole. Some markers still held traces of names, dates, final messages meant to last generations, now nearly erased by greed and expediency. By noon, they had photographed enough evidence to prove the stones weren't random landscaping material. The pattern was clear. Footstones had been systematically repurposed, their sacred purpose dismissed for cheap construction materials. "This is more than we hoped for," June said, reviewing her photos. "But we still need the connection between the ledger and the actual relocations, without proof that bodies weren't moved properly." Theodore nodded grimly, watching Rook nose through another patch of reeds. The dog's dedication to uncovering these lost markers struck him as both blessing and burden. Each stone recovered was both evidence gained and desecration confirmed. The midday sun now illuminated every detail of their discovery. The wired-together stones, the crude attempts to disguise their true nature, the ghostly traces of names and dates that no amount of weathering could completely erase. Theodore's crude map showed clusters of markers that corresponded to his memories of the old cemetery layout. A final indignity to those who should have rested in peace. June's article appeared in the Pine Hollow Gazette 3 days later. She'd written it carefully, describing weathered stone fragments with partially visible initials, and dates consistent with the old churchyard's operation. The piece was factual and measured, avoiding direct accusations while raising legitimate questions about construction materials used in the new development. The response was immediate. June's office phone began ringing steadily with calls from local families. Many had relatives buried in the old cemetery, and the possibility that their loved ones' markers had been mishandled struck deep nerves. "Another 3 calls this morning," June told Theodore over coffee at his kitchen table. "People wanting to know if we found their family names?" Theodore rubbed his tired eyes. "And bails." "His lawyers sent this." She pulled out a formal letter printed on heavy paper. "They're threatening legal action for trespassing and defamation." "What about the easement angle?" "Public right-of-way ends at the drainage ditch, but that should be enough to document more stones if we're careful." Private security vehicles had begun appearing regularly near the development site. Black SUVs with tinted windows made slow passes along the perimeter road. The message was clear. They were being watched. Despite the pressure, Theodore and June returned to the site the next morning. They stayed carefully within the public easement, documenting what they could see from the legal side of the property line. Rook kept close to Theodore's heel, unusually tense. The steady thrum of heavy machinery filled the air. Through the trees, they could see a yellow backhoe working near the retention pond's berm. "They're moving earth again," Theodore said quietly, "trying to bury the evidence deeper." June raised her camera, zooming in on the fresh excavation. "Look how wet that soil is. The whole bank could—" A low rumble cut off her words. The saturated earth at the edge of the berm suddenly shifted, sending a wave of mud and debris cascading down toward them. June had only seconds to react, as the slurry rushed at her feet. "June!" Theodore shouted as she lost her footing. The mud flow swept her toward the nearby culvert, its dark mouth waiting to swallow her. But Rook was already moving. The German shepherd lunged forward, powerful jaws clamping onto June's jacket. His strong body strained against the mud's pull, giving Theodore the precious moments he needed to reach. Them. Theodore's hands found June's arms, and with Rook's help, he hauled her away from the culvert's deadly suction. They scrambled up to safer ground, all three covered in mud but alive. June sat trembling on solid earth, her breathing ragged. "That was no accident," she managed finally. "The timing—" Theodore nodded grimly. "Bales is sending a message. He's willing to hurt people to keep this quiet." Despite her shaken state, June's reporter's instincts kicked in. She raised her mud-spattered camera and began documenting the aftermath. The slide had exposed fresh evidence, new tangles of wired stones tumbled free of their concealment, track marks from the backhoe clear in the disturbed earth. "Look," Theodore pointed to a freshly exposed stone. Even from this distance, the drill holes were visible. More proof of what they did. But they both knew they couldn't stay. The backhoe's engine had gone silent, and the security vehicles would surely be checking the disturbance soon. "We need to go," Theodore said, helping June to her feet. "But this isn't over." Back at Theodore's house, they cleaned up and assessed their next steps. The mudslide had made one thing crystal clear. They needed absolute proof before moving forward, the kind of evidence that would stand up in court. "We have to connect the stones to official records," June said, wrapping her hands around a warm mug of tea. "Show that these aren't just random markers, but specific headstones that should be with their original graves." Theodore pulled out his old cemetery maps. "If we can match even one stone's markings to the burial records—" "Then we can prove intent," June finished. "Prove that Bales knew exactly what he was doing when he used these stones as riprap." Rook lay at their feet, still alert, still watching the door. His quick action had saved June's life, but they all knew the next confrontation might not end as well. The stakes were clear now. This wasn't just about exposed secrets anymore. It was about how far Conrad Bales would go to keep those secrets buried. "We do this smart," Theodore said firmly. "No more direct confrontations, not until we have proof no one can deny." June nodded, her hands still shaking slightly as she sipped her tea. The mud on her clothes was a stark reminder of how quickly things could turn deadly. But the image of those wired stones, stripped of their sacred purpose and used as mere construction material, strengthened her resolve. They had the photos, they had witnesses starting to come forward, and most importantly, they had each other. Now they just needed the one piece of evidence that would make their case undeniable, the direct link between the desecrated stones and the records of the dead they were meant to honor. The county morgue's basement office smelled of old paper and coffee. Dr. Harlan Keats' silver hair caught the fluorescent light as he closed the door behind them. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man, who knew the weight of every action. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," he said, pulling a thick ledger from his filing cabinet. The leather binding was worn smooth at the corners. "This is the transfer record for the churchyard relocation." Theodore and June exchanged glances. They hadn't expected help from an official source, especially not after the mudslide warning. "Why help us?" June asked, her reporter's instinct pushing for context. Dr. Keats' steady eyes met hers. "Because some things shouldn't stay buried." He opened the ledger to a marked page. "Look at the Angel Field section entries." Theodore leaned forward, his finger tracing down the neat columns. The entries were perfect, too perfect. Every line filled with identical handwriting, no corrections, no margin notes. "In 30 years of death records," Dr. Keats said quietly, "I've never seen entries this clean. Real records have mistakes, coffee stains, multiple handwriting styles." June was already taking notes. "You're saying these were rewritten?" "Look at the dates." Keat pointed to a sequence of numbers. "These supposedly show individual disinterments over 2 weeks, but the ink density is identical. These were all written at the same time." Theodore felt his chest tighten. "The babies section, Angel Field, it was never moved?" "No," Keat confirmed. "I tried raising concerns back then. Nobody wanted to hear it. Your maintenance clearance form helped complete their paper trail." The words hit Theodore like physical blows. His signature, his unquestioning trust. He'd helped make this possible. "The retention pond," he said, voice rough. "They built it right over—" "Yes." Keats' voice held no judgment, only tired certainty. "The original plans show Angel Field exactly where that pond sits now." June touched Theodore's arm, sensing his distress. "This isn't just about mishandled remains anymore," she said. "They erased these children. Their names, their resting places, everything." Theodore straightened, grief hardening into purpose. "Then we restore them, all of them, not just expose the fraud, but bring back their names." "We'll need to be methodical," June said, photographer's eye already planning. "Match the stones we've found to these ledger entries. Document the exact locations. Prove the relocation claims were false." Dr. Keat nodded. "I can help establish chain of custody for any evidence you find. Just be careful. Bales has friends in high places." "We need copies," June said, already pulling out her phone to photograph the ledger pages. "Take these too." Keat handed over a stack of original survey maps. "They show the real layout before the relocation. Compare them to what you found." Theodore studied the maps, his years of groundskeeper experience letting him read between the lines. "The elevation changes don't match their story. You can't move graves on that timeline with those grade differences." "Exactly," Keat said. "The physics don't work. The equipment they claimed to use couldn't have done the job in that time frame." June was making rapid notes. "We need to connect everything. The ledger entries, the physical evidence, the timeline impossibilities. Start with Angel Field," Keat advised. "It's the clearest example of the fraud. The smallest coffins, the most vulnerable victims." Theodore's hands clenched on the edge of the desk. His daughter's stone, the one that had started all this, would have been in that section. "We'll do this right," June promised, seeing his pain. "Document everything. Build an airtight case." "Just watch yourselves," Keat warned. "After that mudslide, it's clear Bales isn't above accidents." They carefully copied everything they could, June's camera clicking quietly in the basement silence. Theodore memorized the maps, matching them against his memories of the grounds. "When this breaks," June said as they prepared to leave, "we'll need you to go on record." Keat nodded. "I've carried this long enough. It's time for truth." Back in June's car, they sat for a moment, processing what they'd learned. The weight of it pressed down on Theodore's chest, Not just fraud now, but desecration, erasure, his own unwitting part in it. "We're going to make this right," June said softly, seeing his struggle. Theodore nodded, finding strength in her certainty. They had names now. Dates. Official records to match against the stones Rook had found. It wasn't just scattered evidence anymore. It was the beginning of restoration. They had become more than investigators. They were now guardians of a sacred trust, voices for those who had been silenced. The path ahead was dangerous, but they had truth on their side. And for Theodore, that truth came with a chance for redemption. June pulled up her laptop screen, studying the drone footage from that morning. The high-resolution images showed the retention wall in stark detail, each stone visible from above. "Look at this pattern," she said, zooming in. "They didn't even try to hide it, just lined them up like bricks." Theodore leaned closer, his groundskeeper's eye picking out familiar shapes. "Those darker ones there, those are definitely footstones. The mineral buildup can't hide the original cuts." They had spent the past 3 days documenting everything. Rook had proven tireless, nose to the ground, bringing stone after stone from the muddy banks. Each one they cleaned revealed more history, initials, dates, fragments of names that matched the ledger entries Dr. Keat had shown them. 47 stones so far, June said, checking her catalog, all with dates matching the churchyard records. Theodore's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Mr. Hoyt." The woman's voice was tense, careful. "This is Lorena Pike, Conrad Bales' sister." Theodore put the phone on speaker, catching June's startled look. "I have information," Lorena continued, "about the churchyard relocation, invoices that prove what really happened." "Why come forward now?" June asked. "Because I helped create those invoices." Lorena's voice cracked slightly. "I was his accountant. I knew what he was doing. Acid washing the stones, drilling them for wire, relabeling everything as landscaping supplies. I can't carry that anymore." They arranged to meet in 30 minutes, in the busy parking lot of a chain restaurant. "Safety in crowds," Lorena insisted. The lot was half full when they arrived. Lorena Pike stood by her car, clutching a manila envelope. She had their brother's height, but none of his cold confidence. Her hands shook slightly as she passed over the envelope. "Everything's here," she said quietly. "Purchase orders for industrial acid, labor costs for stone processing disguised as erosion control, equipment rental that matches the dates of the relocation." June examined the documents, phone ready to capture images. "These are originals?" "Copies from my personal files. I kept everything." Lorena glanced around nervously. "The metadata will confirm when they were created. You can trace the paper trail through shell companies he used." Theodore studied an invoice, recognizing the stonework terminology twisted to hide its true purpose. "These tool marks you've listed, they match what we're finding. Rush job, minimal care." "He needed it done fast," Lorena confirmed. "Real relocation would have taken months. Proper documentation. This way was cheaper, quicker." "And your conscience?" June asked gently. Lorena's shoulders sagged. "I told myself it was just business. But I drive past that subdivision every day, knowing what's under that pond." They spent 20 minutes going through the documents, June photographing everything while Theodore compared notes to his own observations. The evidence aligned perfectly. Too perfectly to ignore. Back at June's house, they spread everything out. Drone footage showing the systematic placement of stones, photos of each recovered marker, dates and initials visible through the mineral stains. Lorena's invoices revealing the methodical destruction of sacred ground. "We need to move on this before Bales can bury it," June said, checking weather reports. "There's a storm system coming in next week." Heavy rain predicted. You want to use that? Theodore asked. June nodded. The symbolism would be powerful. Truth rising from the flood, and the rain might expose more evidence as the ground shifts. It's risky, Theodore cautioned. That last mudslide nearly killed you. A real storm could be worse. That's exactly why we need to act openly, June argued. No more sneaking around. We do this in full view, where they can't accidentally silence us. Theodore considered it, thinking of Rook's careful retrievals, each stone a piece of rescued truth. We need to be prepared, he said finally. Not provocative. Get everything documented and backed up first. Agreed. June started, organizing files. I'll contact my editor, have everything ready to publish the moment we move. Lorena's documents give us the financial proof we needed. They worked late into the evening, matching stones to ledger entries, cross-referencing Lorena's invoices with their physical evidence. The pattern was undeniable now, not just negligence or corner-cutting, but deliberate desecration for profit. Theodore handled each stone with growing certainty, his expertise confirming what the documents revealed. The tool marks told the story. Hasty work with industrial equipment, no respect for what was being destroyed. His fingers traced the ghost of a name, remembering his years of careful maintenance in the old churchyard. We'll need to move quickly once we start, June said, reviewing their evidence folders. Bales will try to discredit everything. Let him try, Theodore replied. The truth is literally written in stone. They continued preparing, aware that each passing day brought both the storm and their confrontation closer. But now they had what they needed: documents, images, physical evidence, and most importantly, the testimony of someone from inside Bales's operation. The pieces were in place. Soon, the rain would come, and with it, their chance to restore what had been erased. Theodore thought of his daughter's stone, the first piece of truth Rook had brought home. They would make this right, not just for her, but for all of them. The morning dawned heavy with promise and threat. Dark clouds massed on the horizon as Theodore, June, and Lorena gathered at their designated positions near the retention pond. The air felt charged, electric with anticipation. June set up her live stream equipment with practiced efficiency, checking angles and connections. Her hands moved steadily, despite the tension evident in her shoulders. We're going live in 5 minutes, she announced, adjusting her camera tripod. Everything's backed up to 3 different clouds. They can't shut this down. Lorena sat in her car, laptop open, fingers hovering over her keyboard. I have everything organized by date. The moment you give the signal, I'll start sending the files to the state attorney's office. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were determined. Theodore stood watching a flatbed truck rumble up to the pond's edge. Through the mesh of industrial bags labeled erosion control aggregate, he could see the distinctive shapes of processed stone. His experienced eye caught the telltale glint of drill holes and wire ties. Remember, June said, checking her drone's battery level, keep it calm, keep it clear, let the evidence speak. She pressed a button, and the small drone hummed to life, rising smoothly into the gray morning air. The live stream counter began ticking up as June went live. Good morning, she spoke clearly into her microphone. We're here at the Pine Hollow Development Retention Pond where serious allegations of grave desecration are about to be addressed. Theodore walked purposefully toward the flatbed, where Conrad Bales stood directing workers. The developer's expensive suit looked out of place against the muddy construction site. 2 security guards in dark uniforms flanked him, hands resting near their belts. Mr. Bales, Theodore called out, his voice carrying across the site. Those bags need to be opened and inspected. Bales turned, his face hardening as he recognized Theodore. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "The easement extends 3 feet past the water line," Theodore responded, pointing to the survey markers. "We're within our rights to be here." June's drone captured the scene from above, showing the growing crowd of onlookers. Local families who had seen her earlier coverage were gathering, phones raised to record. The livestream comment section exploded with activity. "These bags," Theodore continued, reaching for one of the mesh sacks, "contain headstones and footstones from the old churchyard, stolen markers, acid-washed and wired together." "That's ridiculous," Bales scoffed, but his face had reddened. "This is standard erosion control material. Security, keep him away from that truck." June switched between camera views, showing close-ups of the stones visible through the mesh. "If you look closely," she narrated, "you can see the drill holes used to wire the stones together and traces of lettering beneath the mineral buildup." Thunder rolled overhead as Lorena began her part. Documents started flowing to the state attorney's office. Invoices for industrial acid, equipment rentals, labor costs carefully mislabeled as landscaping expenses. Each file ping-ponged across social media as viewers shared screenshots. "The evidence is quite clear," Theodore said, his voice steady. "Would you like to open these bags yourself, Mr. Bales? Show everyone what's really inside?" Bales took a step back, his composure cracking. "This is harassment. These people are interfering with a legitimate construction project." But the momentum had shifted. June's drone footage showed the systematic placement of the riprap along the pond's edge. Her handheld camera captured close-ups of partially visible names and dates through the mesh. Lorena's documents provided the paper trail, connecting every piece of physical evidence to specific financial transactions. The viewer count climbed past 1,000, then 5,000. Comments poured in from families who had lost track of loved ones' markers during the relocation. Local news vans began arriving, drawn by the viral spread of the live stream. "Just touch the netting," Theodore urged, gesturing to the bags. "Show everyone these are ordinary stones." Bales refused to move closer to the truck. His security guards looked increasingly uncertain, watching the growing crowd of witnesses. The storm pressed closer, dark clouds now directly overhead. Thunder cracked again, louder this time. The retention pond's surface had risen noticeably, water lapping higher against its earthen walls. "The documents don't lie," June announced to her audience, displaying Lorena's latest transmission. "Internal emails showing deliberate mislabeling of cemetery markers as construction material, purchase orders for industrial cleaning agents used to erase names and dates." The wind picked up, rippling through the crowd. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, but no one moved. All eyes were fixed on Bales, on the loaded flatbed, on the evidence mounting with each passing minute. Theodore stood his ground, rain beginning to darken his shoulders. "These were people's final markers," he said, his voice carrying clearly through June's microphone. "Children, parents, generations of this town's history. You didn't just move them, you tried to erase them." The pond water rose higher, churning now with the strengthening storm. But the real pressure was mounting in the court of public opinion, as hundreds, then thousands of viewers watched the confrontation unfold in real time. The truth was rising, just as they'd planned, carried on the storm's edge, broadcast to countless witnesses, documented beyond any possibility of denial. And still the thunder rolled closer, and still the water rose against the retention wall. A blinding flash split the darkness, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the ground. The storm had arrived in full force, unleashing sheets of rain that turned the construction site into a treacherous mess of mud and standing water. At the retention pond's edge, the saturated earth began to crumble. The spillway, already weakened by earlier erosion, started to give way under the relentless downpour. A deep groan emanated from the earthen wall as chunks of soil sloughed away. "The wall's failing!" June shouted into her microphone, keeping her camera steady despite the wind and rain. Her live stream captured the horrifying moment when the ground beneath the flatbed truck began to shift. The trailer, heavy with its cargo of stolen markers, listed dangerously toward the growing breach. Metal screamed against metal as the weight of the mesh sacks dragged the entire vehicle toward the torrent. Bales scrambled into the cab, desperately trying to start the engine. Rook, who had been patrolling the bank's edge, lost his footing on the disintegrating soil. The loyal German shepherd yelped as he tumbled into the churning waters below. The current immediately swept him toward the culvert's gaping maw. "Rook!" Theodore's cry was barely audible above the storm. Without a moment's hesitation, he sprinted toward the edge and dove into the roiling water. The icy shock nearly knocked the breath from his lungs, but his focus remained laser-sharp on his dog's struggling form. From her position on higher ground, June split her attention between filming and calling for help. 911, we need emergency services at the Pine Hollow development site. Immediately, she reported, her voice trembling but professional. We have a structural collapse and 2 people in the water. The flatbed continued its inexorable slide toward destruction. Bales clung to the steering wheel, white-knuckled and wild-eyed. "Cut the load!" June screamed at him. "Release the stones before the whole truck goes in!" But Bales remained frozen, refusing to act. Releasing the mesh bags would mean exposing their contents to hundreds of watching eyes. Even now, with lives at stake, he chose to protect his secret rather than help. Theodore fought against the current, powerful arms cutting through the muddy water as he made his way toward Rook. The dog's dark head bobbed in and out of view, being pulled ever closer to the dangerous culvert. Finally, Theodore's fingers found purchase on Rook's collar. "I've got you, boy," he gasped, but the words were lost in the roar of water and wind. The live stream counter ticked past 10,000 viewers as June's camera captured the stark tableau, Theodore and Rook struggling in the floodwaters, while Bales remained paralyzed in the cab, unwilling to sacrifice his carefully hidden evidence even as disaster unfolded. A fresh surge of water crashed over them. Theodore disappeared beneath the foam-flecked surface, taking Rook with him. Seconds stretched into eternity before they resurfaced, now barely keeping their heads above water. The current had strengthened, dragging them closer to the culvert's maw. The flatbed groaned and slipped further, its wheels now completely off solid ground. The movement created a wave that hit Theodore and Rook full force. June's heart stopped as she watched Rook's collar slip through Theodore's desperate fingers. "No!" The cry tore from multiple throats, viewers and onlookers alike bearing witness to the unfolding tragedy. The German shepherd's dark form separated from his master, both of them now at the mercy of the raging waters. Through it all, June's camera continued to roll, documenting every second of the crisis. The contrast could not have been starker. Theodore risking everything to save his loyal companion, while Bales remained paralyzed by self-interest, clutching his secrets even as lives hung in the balance. The storm's fury increased, rain hammering down like bullets on the churning water. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. The failing wall, the tilting flatbed, and the desperate struggle playing out in the floodwaters below. In that brief, bright moment, the thousands watching could see the truth written in more than just stone. It was etched in every choice being made, every action and inaction revealing the true nature of those involved. The roar of the water made all communication impossible. There were no words left, only the primal struggle for survival playing out before countless witnessing eyes. The flatbed slewed sideways, now completely caught in the pull of the collapse. And in the waters below, Theodore made one last desperate grab for Rook's collar, his fingers brushing fur before the current tore them apart. Theodore fought against the current, his muscles burning with effort. The bank wasn't far, just 15 feet of churning water between him and solid ground. With one powerful kick, he propelled himself toward the eroding edge. His fingers found purchase in the mud, and he pulled himself up, gasping for air. But there was no time to rest. Through the sheets of rain, he could see the flatbed trailer continuing its deadly dance with gravity. If it went into the spillway, the evidence would be lost forever. More importantly, Rook was still out there, struggling against the flood. Theodore scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward his truck. His hands shook as he yanked out the heavy-duty tow strap from behind the seat. The yellow nylon glowed like a beacon in the stormy gloom. "What are you doing?" June called out, still holding her phone steady, documenting every moment for thousands of watching eyes. "Saving what I can," Theodore shouted back. He raced to the tilting flatbed, his boots sliding in the mud. Working quickly, he looped the strap around the rear axle, pulling it tight with practiced hands. The other end he secured to a massive sycamore tree that had stood sentinel over this land long before any development began. June's voice carried over the storm, narrating the unfolding events for her viewers. Theodore Hoyt is attempting to stabilize the trailer containing the suspected grave markers. The drone feed shows, yes, you can see him securing a tow strap to prevent further sliding. Above them, the small drone held steady despite the wind, its camera capturing the entire scene. The failing retention wall, the precariously balanced flatbed, and Theodore's desperate race against time. Without pausing to check if the strap would hold, Theodore plunged back into the floodwaters. Rook was still fighting the current, his dark head barely visible among the waves. Theodore pushed through the water with powerful strokes, calling out to his faithful companion, "Here, boy! Come on, Rook! Swim to me!" The German shepherd's ears perked up at his master's voice. With renewed energy, Rook paddled toward Theodore's outstretched hands. Theodore managed to grab his collar and guide him toward the slope. "Up! Go up!" Theodore commanded, giving Rook a firm push toward the bank. The dog's claws scrabbled against the mud, finding purchase in exposed tree roots. With one final heave, Rook pulled himself to safety, shaking water from his coat. Behind them, the tow strap groaned as it took the weight of the flatbed. The trailer shuddered and lurched, but the line held firm. The sycamore's deep roots refused to yield to the pressure. A shout of alarm cut through the rain. Bales had attempted to abandon the cab, but the shifting weight had thrown him off balance. He slid across the wet metal, heading straight for the churning spillway. Theodore had every reason to let him fall. This was the man who had desecrated graves, who had tried to bury the truth along with the stones. But something deeper than vengeance moved Theodore's feet. He lunged forward, catching Bales's wrist just as the developer's feet lost contact with the trailer. For a moment, they locked eyes. The man who had tried to erase the dead, and the man who fought to preserve their memory. "Hold on!" Theodore's voice was firm, brooking no argument. He planted his feet and pulled, muscles straining as he dragged Bales back from the edge. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the storm's fury. June's steady commentary continued, her phone capturing every detail. "Emergency services are arriving now. The developer, Conrad Bales, nearly fell into the floodwaters but was saved by Theodore Hoyt, the very man whose evidence exposed this situation." Security guards stood at the perimeter, uncertain whether to interfere, as witnesses shouted encouragement from safe positions. The first police cruiser skidded to a halt in the construction lot, lights painting the rain in red and blue. As the floodwaters began to recede, June smoothly pivoted her camera's focus. I'm now receiving confirmation that Lorena Pike's files have been successfully delivered to the state attorney's office. These documents appear to show systematic false billing for grave relocations that never occurred. She panned across the scattered contents of several burst mesh bags, where wired stones lay exposed to the light. As you can see, these are clearly carved markers, many still showing traces of names and dates. They've been deliberately altered and concealed as construction material. Deputies approached with purpose, taking in the scene. One began documenting the evidence with a department camera, while another spoke into his radio, requesting additional units. Bales stood in shocked silence, water dripping from his expensive suit, as a deputy approached with handcuffs visible on his belt. "Sir, you'll need to come with us. We have some questions about these materials and Ms. Pike's documentation." The developer's face had lost all color. "I want my lawyer," he managed to say, his voice hollow. "That's your right, sir," the deputy replied. "But right now you're being detained pending investigation." The handcuffs clicked shut around Bales's wrists, the sound carrying clearly on June's live stream. Theodore stood back, one hand resting on Rook's wet fur. The dog pressed against his leg, both of them watching as the man who had tried to bury the past was led away to face the consequences of his actions. The evidence chain was preserved, documented in real time by hundreds of witnesses and June's unflinching camera. The rain began to soften, and the first responders moved efficiently to secure the scene. The immediate danger had passed, but the impact of what had transpired here would ripple far beyond the banks of this retention pond. Truth, like the stones themselves, had finally risen to the surface. The days following the flood brought swift action. State investigators descended on Pine Hollow, armed with Lorena Pike's meticulous records and Dr. Keats' coroner's ledger. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the retention pond area, while forensic teams carefully documented and photographed each stone they recovered. Theodore watched from behind the tape as workers in protective gear gently unwound wire after wire, freeing the footstones from their unnatural bonds. Each one was tagged, photographed, and cross-referenced against the original cemetery records. The process was slow but deliberate, treating each marker with the dignity it had been denied. June stood beside him, her reporter's notebook tucked away. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a restoration of truth. Her hand found his, squeezing gently as another stone was freed from the mud. "Number 47, called out a technician. "Partial name visible. Sarah Elizabeth." Theodore's breath caught. He knew that name from the ledger. "She was 3 months old," he said softly. "Pneumonia, 1968. The state attorney, Ellen Martinez, approached them with purpose in her stride. "Mr. Hoyt, Ms. Pennington, we've secured emergency court orders for full excavation. Dr. Keats' documentation was invaluable. The discrepancies in the transfer records are impossible to explain away." "What about Bales?" June asked, her professional instincts surfacing. "He's not talking, but he doesn't need to. Lorena Pike's records tell the whole story. False invoices, doctored permits, even internal emails discussing how to process the markers." Martinez shook her head in disgust. "The evidence is overwhelming." As if to underscore her words, a worker called out from the bank. "We've got another cluster here, at least 12 stones all wired together." Theodore moved closer to the barrier, Rook padding faithfully beside him. The German shepherd's leg had healed well after the flood, though he still favored it slightly. He watched the recovery work with intense focus, as if understanding the gravity of what he had first discovered. Days turned into weeks. The retention pond was carefully drained, revealing dozens more stones embedded in its walls. Each discovery brought new families forward, sharing stories of loved ones they thought had been peacefully relocated. The truth hurt, but it also healed, bringing closure to those who had been denied even the comfort of knowing where their loved ones truly rested. In his workshop, Theodore spent his evenings hunched over his workbench, carefully cleaning and restoring the markers that could be saved. But one stone commanded special attention. Fresh marble, carefully selected, lay before him as he traced the letters that would mark his daughter's final resting place. His chisel moved with practiced precision, each strike purposeful and sure. No longer did his hands shake with guilt. Now they were steady with resolution. The simple marker took shape under his careful work. Grace Elizabeth Hoyt, followed by the dates that bracketed her brief existence. June visited often during these evening sessions, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just sitting quietly while he worked. She understood the weight of what he was doing, not just carving stone, but reclaiming purpose from pain. "I've been thinking," she said one evening, watching him smooth the edges of Grace's marker. "This work, it's going to take time. Months, maybe years, to restore all the names." Theodore nodded, not looking up from his task. "I know, and I'll see it through, every last one." "We'll see it through," June corrected gently. "I'm not going anywhere." He paused then, looking up at her with eyes that had grown softer over these weeks. The harsh edges of grief had been worn smooth by purpose, like water over stone. "Thank you," he said simply. But the words carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. The day they placed Grace's marker was quiet, intimate. No cameras, no reporters, just Theodore, June, and Rook standing in the restored section of Angelfield. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as Theodore carefully settled the stone into place. He knelt there for a long moment, one hand resting on the cool marble. "I'm sorry I signed those papers," he whispered, "but I'm making it right now, Grace. For you and for all of them." June's hand settled on his shoulder, warm and steady. Rook pressed against his other side, offering silent support. Together they stood in the growing light, surrounded by the markers of children whose names were no longer lost. Later that afternoon, Theodore sat at his kitchen table, the ledger open before him. Pages of notes surrounded it, names to be confirmed, stones to be carved, families to be contacted. It was no longer a burden but a calling, each entry representing a truth to be restored. "Ready to start the next batch?" June asked, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table. Theodore looked up, meeting her eyes with quiet certainty. "Stone by stone," he said, "line by line, until they're all named." Rook dozed in a patch of sunlight nearby, his job of discovery complete. But Theodore's work was just beginning, a labor of love and redemption that would fill the years ahead. The grief that had once isolated him had transformed into a purpose that connected him to others, especially to June, who had chosen to walk this path beside him. The evening light slanted through the windows, catching the fresh carved letters of practice stones lined up on his workbench. Each one represented a name to be restored, a truth to be told, a memory to be honored. And in that quiet moment, Theodore knew he had found not just justice, but healing, not just purpose, but love. The signature that had once enabled a lie had led him, through pain and courage, to a truth that would define the rest of his life. Thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.